Now, don't run for school board. That was the provocative headline for a recent article published by Christianity Today. The article, which I would encourage you to read, argues that personal discipleship is preferable to what the author describes as culture war battles, like running for school board. But do we have to choose between influencing the culture and discipling our children? Why would someone suggest we do? Joining me now to discuss all of it in our weekly Worldview segment is David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at FRC. David, good to see you today.
Hey, great to see you. Happy Friday, Joseph.
Happy Friday. Now, this headline caught my attention because, of course, we here at FRC, we run school board boot camps, among other things, right? Which is all around the country. We've been encouraging people and equipping people and training people to run for school board. So when a headline published in Christianity Today says, don't run for school board, of course, that gets our attention. Now, let's review some of the reasons why someone might want to run for school board. We want to remove pornography from curriculum or from the school libraries. And we've seen there's lots of documented cases of that. And I think the word pornography applies appropriately and reasonably, regardless of how you feel about school boards. We'd like to stop drag queens from attending school assemblies because we've seen lots of examples of that happening. We'd like to stop teachers from telling 6-year-olds that they can change their gender if they want to. We'd like to keep boys out of the girls' locker room. We have multiple documented cases of sexual assaults taking places in that context when boys identify as girls go into women's facilities. All of those might motivate, and in fact have motivated people to say, hey, enough is enough. I don't like this. I'm going to run for school board. It's not because it pays a lot of money, but because I feel like I need to do something about the status quo. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of that, is there?
No, there's not, Joseph. And, you know, this article, I think it's worth looking at. Like you said, I encourage folks to read this author's argument, Bonnie Christian. I don't know Bonnie, but she makes this argument in Christianity Today. Now, to be fair to her, often articles like this, editors pick out the catchy headlines. But when you get into the meat of her argument, that essentially is the argument that she's making. She's writing, I think, largely to Christian parents and saying, you know, now that we're all going back to school, one of the things that's going to return to the news is these viral sound bites of parents going to school boards and making the case for change. And if we had to really boil down the crux of her argument, her main argument is that discipleship in the home should far surpass doing things like running for school board, that our energies, our attentions should be focused on discipleship. And, you know, Joseph, when I read that article, you know, I read that her argument, it's like, well, why can't we do both? And I think that would be the appropriate response of thoughtful Christians, that we do both. The love of neighbor, Christian faithfulness in the public square requires us to do both, I would argue.
Well, and I think that's fair, and I want to get into that. And I think that is many people's instinctive reaction, because the argument that she makes is essentially it's more important that you disciple your children. And the point that I think she makes that is fair and true and valid and that we need to take to heart is that the kind of change that we want to have in our kids' lives, the kind of people that they want to become, we want them to become, that's not going to happen at the school board level, right? We could have all the perfect books in the school library. We could have the perfect curriculum, whatever that is. But if we're not discipling them at home, they're not going to become the people that we want them to be, right? So it is true that should be a priority, isn't it?
No, it absolutely is. And what I would argue, and you and I have talked about this before, is that, you know, Christian parents need to view themselves as the primary disciple makers in their own homes. Deuteronomy 6, I think, is the text that Christian parents have looked at for millennia for how to think about their responsibility in their own home. But my goodness, when we think about schools, I've heard you cite the statistic several times, Joseph, is that our children from K through 12th grade will spend 16,000 hours in those schools. And why in the world would we surrender those 16,000 hours to the moral revolutionaries? And an important point to make to Bonnie's argument, Joseph, is she seems very hesitant. And she says downright that we shouldn't really be engaging in culture wars. She mentions the 1990s and the culture wars that seems to have left a bad taste in our mouth. But the important point I think to make is those of us who are conservative evangelicals, we weren't the ones who initiated the so-called culture wars. It's the left, it's the more revolutionaries who want to introduce LGBT, gender-affirming indoctrination as young as kindergarten. We're not the ones wanting to bring drag queens into elementary schools. And so we didn't ask for the culture wars, but if we find ourselves in a culture war, I think as faithful Christians, we need to engage, and we need to engage biblically, and we need to engage faithfully.
And let's talk about that for a moment, because I think you characterized that correctly. You know, we go back 50 years and they weren't having these problems at the school board, right? And so there was a lot of maybe even apathy and indifference from the church about what was going on in the schools at the school board level, because generally speaking, we felt like it was safe. Now, that undoubtedly has changed. And that's not changed because, as you say, we're not the ones trying to bring drag queens into the school. But the argument made here and the sentiment expressed specifically is not unique in the church. There's a lot of people who seem to express this idea that it would be better for us to just let it go, let it slide, stop objecting, because then it will be more peaceful, right? We'll get along better with our neighbors if we just let the drag queens have their way and do their thing in the elementary school. Why is that sentiment so popular within the church today, in your opinion?
Well, I think this kind of goes back to even the way Christians have approached engaging in politics. So Wayne Grudem talks about, we should, this view that has kind of become ascendant, that we do evangelism and not politics. And in my view, I think Grudem's right when he says that's kind of an impoverished view of thinking about the public square. One of the things that has always guided my engagement, Joseph, is the second great commandment, that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think the impulse that many Christians feel to enter into these public debates and to enter into these school board meetings is out of love of neighbor. Because as Christians, it's not just enough to love and care for our own children. We also as Christians care for the children of everybody else. We care for the health of society. We care for the future of civilization. And so if the more revolutionaries had their way, their vision of a fair and just society, I would argue, is antithetical to what Christians would understand a thriving and flourishing society would be. And so, again, we didn't ask for these debates and to these skirmishes to start, but if we find ourselves in them, we have to engage, again, out of love of neighbor and in the name of Christian faithfulness.
Now, David, another way I want to address this is that we wouldn't use this argument that we need to prioritize the discipleship of our children to discourage people from getting involved in other ministries. We'll never see a headline that says, don't feed the poor because you're spending too much time feeding the poor and therefore you're neglecting the discipleship of your children. Now, theoretically, that's possible. Someone could be so interested in feeding the poor that they have neglected the parenting and discipleship and love and care of their own children. And if we happened upon that situation, we're not likely to say, hey, you need to really stop feeding the poor. We would say, you need to make sure you're discipling your children as well. And maybe you should take your children with you when you feed the poor, and then you can do that together and they can watch you model how to live like Jesus, right? So do you think that it's fair do Christians have a hard time seeing something like running for school board as a legitimate expression of their faith?
I think so, Joseph. I think some people, and again, I think sometimes we compartmentalize things in our lives. We'll say, okay, reading our Bible and prayer and talking about the Lord, those are things we do kind of in our church bubble, our spiritual bubble, but then there's other things that are secular, that are things out in the world. And I think that's where a Christian worldview shows us that the Bible has principles and values that inform everything we do, everything that we engage in, every person that we meet. The Biblical Worldview helps us to realize that every sphere of human activity is under the authority and auspice of God, and we're required to act faithfully in every sphere that we find ourselves in. And so I think as Christians, being a Christian is not just something we do on Sunday, it's something we also do Monday through Saturday as well. And so one of the reasons we engage in school board races, the reason we vote, the reason we engage really in any sort of politics is out of love of neighbor. It's because we are to be the people who are uniquely Christian in all aspects of our life. And I would just encourage what FRC has been doing for a while is, school boards, politics is local, and school boards make a lot of decisions. We're not far away from Loudoun County, Virginia, where decisions by the school board to let biological boys into the intimate spaces like showers and locker rooms of biological females led to female students getting raped. And so those bad policies had a direct effect on the well-being of middle and high school girls. That's a big deal. And again, I think that's why as Christians we need to be engaging in all spheres wherever we find ourselves.
David, there's another statement here that I want to read to you and get your response to. She says in the article, quote, "If you have the time, wherewithal, and resources to run for school board, you're probably also capable of taking on the costs and inconveniences of other schooling options," end quote. And there she suggests that rather than run for school board, you're probably in a position to take your kids somewhere else. And if you can take your kids somewhere else that you're happier, you should be content. You don't need to run for school board. What's your reaction to that argument?
Well, again, I want to be charitable to this author. I don't know this author personally, but when I read that part of the piece, Joseph, I think it struck me as almost a naive and pretty much of an elitist comment to make. That, okay, well, some people might, if they're really concerned about it, just take your kid out and put them in the private or classical school or homeschool them. The vast majority, I know, public schools are hemorrhaging students by the millions, but still, the vast majority of America's children are in the public school system. And again, as Christians, we shouldn't just care about our own children. We care about all the children in our society and in our community. And so I would push back against that argument, saying that is not reaching the threshold of what I think Christian faithfulness requires.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we do not as Christians have the luxury of just only being concerned with our kids. If love of neighbor means anything, it means we stand up for other kids as well, and our neighbors' children. And it does seem like a retreatist, which is an interesting way to, I think, perhaps describe that. But the instinct to say, well, my kids are fine. I have the means to take care of them. So, whatever happens to your kids happens. I'm not going to worry about it. But how do we know? I mean, because I think what she is concerned about is this idea that when you run for school board, you go yell at your school board members. You're creating conflict. You're creating division. You do it as a Christian. That means you're making Christianity look bad in the eyes of people who are not Christians. It makes it more difficult for us to evangelize. So you should just be nice to people, let them have their way, and then tell them about Jesus once you're nice to them. How do we know if we are running for the school board for the wrong reasons?
Yeah, I think with anything, Joseph, a verse that we talk about often in Ephesians 4, that we speak the truth in love. And I think if, we can get excited about things and motivated to do certain things like run for school board. I think the posture of our heart is one, and that's between you and the Lord, to make sure that you're doing this for the right reasons. You're doing this as an expression of your love for God and as an expression of your love for neighbor. Joseph, I know you have a piece in the Washington Stand that's on frc.org/worldview. Talking about this, and one of the verses you referenced that I think answers your question is in the verse in Jeremiah where Jeremiah is talking to the exiles here in Babylon, and God doesn't say, don't really get involved in the culture or the society. He says, seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your own welfare. And I think that kind of outlook ought to characterize the way Christians think about this issue and really a host of other issues.
Yeah, I think that's well said, David. The fact is that wherever we are, wherever our kids are going to school, and I'm on record saying that I hope every school board in America ends up being run by homeschool parents, right? So I am for discipling your kids, and I am for taking care of other people's children. But there is the possibility that we do this in destructive and harmful ways. And there is the ability to have our priorities out of whack. And then we can neglect the most important things in our lives in this particular season for things that are less important. But I do believe that Christianity is a multitasking endeavor, and that we can do all of the things that Jesus told us to do simultaneously. If it wasn't possible, he wouldn't have asked us to do it. And final note, David, I will say we did invite the author, Bonnie Christian, to come on and discuss this with us. I actually wish we could talk to the author rather than about these ideas, but she declined to come on. So we've had a great conversation today, and I appreciate you joining us for it. Thanks, David.
Thanks for having me, Joseph.